Okay, we ended our Zoom class by talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I'm just going to review that information a little bit here and finish up the slides for you with my voiceover. I hope this works. So when we're talking about motivation, when we're talking about just about anything in psychology, there are different theories or theoretical perspectives that people propose to try to understand that thing, in this case motivation. We spent a lot of time during the Zoom class talking about more biological theories of motivation, which are very much connected to this idea of homeostasis, uh, and to needs that are very physiological or biological in origin. Needs like the need to breathe and to drink and to eat. The needs that our body has, that are innate, and that we pretty much need to survive and just to live. So you can certainly think of some needs as very much tied to the body, very clearly, and to the need to continue to have a body that's alive. Now, other theoretical perspectives that are focused less on biology, but are more inclusive, include the perspective of Abraham Maslow, pictured here, and his idea that we have a hierarchy of needs. So his theoretical perspective was humanistic. We'll talk a little bit more about humanistic psychologists when we talk about psychotherapy. But in this case, he was just trying to understand what drives people to do what they do in general, and he certainly appreciated that some of what drives us are biological, physiological needs. But he said there are also other kinds of needs, and if that we take all of these into account and try to understand them, we can look at them as operating on a pyramid system. So with this pyramid, at the very base of the pyramid, he said we have our physiological needs. Needs like the need to eat, the need to breathe, etc. Probably sleep. There are a bunch of others. Okay? But then as you go up the pyramid, we have less biologically rooted needs, or needs that can easily be considered connected to the body. And at the very top of this pyramid, he said we have the highest human needs. His perspective has been very influential, and you should definitely know it for the test and consider using it in your paper if you are in one of my classes that has a paper. So here we see his pyramid, and you notice that there are 6 different kinds of needs on the pyramid. The lowest 5 of them were what he primarily theorized at the beginning, but then very late in his theory he added the self-transcendence needs at the top. So from this perspective, we have 6 basic types of needs, and you can also think of them as motivations. So we're motivated to meet physiological or body needs like hunger and thirst. And if we basically have met those needs, he says we can think about needs that aren't quite as vital for our survival, but still might be important, like safety needs. So if I'm not starving, if I can breathe, if I'm not dying of thirst, I can think then about, well, how can I make sure that I'm safe? And as part of this, we can think about how so many people want the world to be organized and predictable, and for them to feel safe, secure, and stable. We talked about the need to feel safe and secure when we talked about attachment theory in the development chapter. In that chapter, we talked about how children attach to caregivers, and they look to those caregivers for a sense of safety and security. This is one of the reasons why it's important for parents to be relatively predictable. Because when things are not predictable, we tend to feel unsafe. We're not sure what we can do to get our needs met. We might have this sense of, I can't control anything. So human beings, just like all animals, tend to thrive in conditions which are relatively predictable. Maybe not 100% predictable, but relatively predictable, and where there don't appear to be threats that are totally out of their control. What we try to do in our lives is set our lives up so that we feel a sense of safety. And different people may have greater or lesser needs for a sense of safety, but it's going to be important for just about everybody to have some sense of safety. And if we feel basically safe, then we can worry about our what you might call our social or our interpersonal needs. And we can think about these in a variety of ways, but he talked about the need to belong. The need to have a sense of belonging in a group is pretty important. We also have a need to feel loved, which is connected to that, and to love other people. We're a social species, and that's very important. And we'll talk later about how terrible loneliness is for our mental health because of that. We also have the needs to feel good about ourselves, a need for self-esteem. Connected to this are the needs to feel a sense of achievement and competence. Those needs can also give you a sense of control, but in addition to feeling safe, by feeling confident and in control, it can give us a sense that we're talented, we're good, we are, hold on. I've got to turn this thing off here. Okay. So we do a lot to feel good about ourselves, basically. That motivates a lot of our behavior. But if we feel okay about ourselves, then we can finally move up to what he thought of as some of the most highest and most evolved, in some sense, human needs. And he talked a lot about the need to self-actualize, which means, in some sense, to keep growing or expanding, to keep learning, improving, to reach our potential. And so we might be feeling like we're improving, or in our work life, or in our interpersonal life. We might do things to sort of meet needs for, learning more information, things like that. He branched out from this later and developed this idea of the need to transcend yourself. And connected to that is a need to find a sense of purpose and meaning in life, and to do things that go beyond yourself, that you're not completely selfish, that you're working for higher goals, like spreading democracy, or spiritual awareness, things of that nature. Okay, so if you're trying to do things that aren't just for yourself and for growing your own self, but for improving others or for values, things of that nature, then that's a self-transcendent need. I realized that was important. Now, from his theoretical perspective, you have to focus on the needs at the bottom of the pyramid before you can move up. Okay. And I could say that this is generally proves to be true with human behavior. But sometimes when we look at human behavior, they tend to put needs that are higher up on the pyramid in front of needs that are lower down in the pyramid. So sometimes the higher needs do end up being prioritized over the lower needs. But most of the time, it's hard to focus on the need for personal growth, for example, if you don't have a meal that's coming, or if you feel like someone's about to kill you. Those things are going to be more important to deal with than, I don't know, to become better at yoga, or to do things to work for the good of others. So a lot of times that's the case. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been a very important idea. If we move through the next slides, I added a bunch of things on the slides to explain this. Okay. So we can think again about these physiological needs as connected to drives, and we talked about drives during the class. But there are generally these other needs as well. Okay. Needs for belonging, self-esteem, self-actualization, and transcendence can sometimes come before the need to eat, sleep, safety, etc., but they typically don't. Okay. One example of this would be fasting for several weeks as part of some sort of spiritual exercise. Or, for example, somebody trying to starve themselves because they think they need to be skinny to be loved. Other psychologists have also talked about the need for self-esteem and the need for belonging. And so from different theoretical perspectives, it's been recognized that this is important. And certainly when people don't feel a sense of belonging, their mental health will suffer. And in fact, when we're rejected, according to a lot of studies, we notice that people feel a very deep sense of pain and distress. And in fact, being rejected or ostracized is one of the most painful things that human beings experience, typically. So we need to feel accepted by others, connected to others, and to maintain social bonds. And this has definitely been, we have evolved to have this need because human beings work best when they live together and cooperate in groups. Therefore, that need to belong is something that evolved to help human beings survive. Now, the need for self-esteem is actually related to that need to belong, but it is somewhat different. And it's really referring to how valued and accepted you feel. How much, what another humanistic psychologist called Carl Rogers said, how much we feel a sense of positive regard. And positive regard for ourselves. The way we typically learn to regard ourselves positively, however, is by being regarded positively by others, by those who love us. And so to have a high sense of self-esteem is often very much connected to having a history of belonging and love in your past, especially in childhood. In addition to belonging, though, our sense of self-esteem also comes from a sense of autonomy, a sense of independence, and the ability that you don't have to depend on others in order to manage your life sometimes. So human beings sort of have these opposing needs, a need to belong and be accepted and be supported, but also a need for autonomy and a sense of independent competence. And so that need for competence was not really incorporated that much into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, although it's sort of connected to the need to self-actualize, the need to keep getting better and improve and meet your potential. So you could think of it as somewhat connected to that. So the book goes over some of the difficulties human beings encounter when their social relationships are not strong. And that really safety is also connected to a sense of having a sense of belonging and connection to others. And when we don't have that connection, we tend to feel very anxious, we tend to feel lonely, jealous perhaps, or guilty. There are all kinds of negative emotional experiences that we will experience if we are rejected by the group, if we don't feel we're accepted. So our self-esteem will be low, but we might also have some of these other emotional experiences, which can be quite painful. And when we look at people who thrive in life, who are happy, probably the most important thing for having a happy life is having good relationships with others and having that sense of belonging. That's one of the top three, if not the top, predictor of people having a happy life. And we notice that people tend to feel best, feel happy, excuse me, often when they're in the presence of other people that they feel close to. And so some of the best times of our lives are with people that, when we're around people that we care about and that care about us. And some of the most painful experiences that we have as humans are related to relationships and perhaps to being rejected or to losing that relationship. We look at loneliness all the time in psychological research connected to this, and we find that people that are lonely are at an elevated risk for mental health. In fact, combined with high levels of stress, it is loneliness which is most predictive of almost all kinds of mental health problems. And so the book talked about some studies which look at when people are ostracized or kicked out of the group, are excluded from the group. And that is one of the most powerful punishment experiences that we have, that we do to other people. We can call this sometimes relational aggression, but certainly when you kick people out of a group, that tends to be very bad for the individual who's been rejected, and it's a powerful way to punish a person. And this is used all the time around the world. And it's used when we put children in timeouts. That sense of isolation can be very punishing for most children. And solitary confinement is what we're using in prisons a lot of the time. And in fact, one reason we know that loneliness is connected to mental health problems is this extreme isolation that we see with solitary confinement can actually lead people to have distinct mental illnesses emerge when they were healthy before. When we look at brain scans of people imagining being ostracized, for example, in some of these studies, we see that the brain, the areas that are connected to physical pain, are active when the person is ostracized. Not all of the areas that are activated when we feel physical pain, but some of them are. So it really is painful to be ostracized. And if people take pain relievers, drugs that relieve pain, that can lessen that kind of psychological pain. This is one of the reasons why we see opioids and opiates, things like heroin, OxyContin, those things having become a big problem in terms of drug abuse. Because the people who are most at risk for developing those kinds of addictions often have a history of trauma as well as a sense of isolation. Okay, so as we look at some studies that have been done specifically on people who have been ostracized by the group, we find them to have a lot more depression, maybe a sense of emotional numbness. We also see they tend to be more likely to be aggressive, and also increased risk of mental decline and poor physical health. The book talked about one example of sometimes people are able to tolerate that kind of ostracism, and that was experienced by Henry Flipper, who was the first black candidate at West Point. So he was ostracized for years there as a way to try to punish him and get him to drop out. Somehow he had the psychological strength to withstand that and became the first African-American West Point graduate. But often people really don't have the ability to withstand that for a length of time very well. So the book has some questions. How have students reacted in studies where they were made to feel rejected and unwanted? What explains these results? So hopefully you'll be able to know the answer to this. People who have been made to feel rejected and unwanted in studies, we find that they tend to do things which are self-defeating, which harm them in the end. They don't do very well on tests of their aptitude or their intelligence. They tend to show less empathy for other people and more aggression. And so when your basic need to belong is not met, it's very bad for your mental health. And it leads people to not succeed and not thrive most of the time. There are some exceptions to this, but generally speaking, that's what we find. So, of course, Maslow mentioned the need for self-esteem. And I mentioned how connected to that is also a need for autonomy. So it's not just belongingness, but a need for autonomy and a need to feel competent and capable and to achieve things. These are all wrapped up. These are all sort of the same thing. Erik Erikson, a psychologist we talked about in the development chapter, argued that we have a fundamental need for independence. So not only to belong, but to be independent. And so Erikson talked a lot about that. And partially we experience that at times as a desire to be unique from other people. This is especially the case in Western societies like the United States, where people often really have a great desire to be unique from others, and it's seen as a good thing. In some other cultures, this is not emphasized as much. But everywhere we look, we see that as we grow up, we increasingly work to be able to do things on our own, be able to be independent, at least to some extent. And that's an important drive for a lot of people. And in fact, when we look at older people, especially in places like the United States, often one of the things they're most afraid of losing is that ability to be independent. They might talk about how they wouldn't want to be a burden on others very much at all and want to be able to live on their own. Okay, so this idea that we're motivated to be competent to be independent and to achieve, a lot of different psychologists have talked about, not just Erickson. So sometimes they may refer to it as achievement motivation, the desire to excel, and sometimes the desire to outperform others. And certainly we have this desire to feel like we're a capable person, to be able to achieve things and to feel in control. In fact, when we look at infants, if you ever hook up an infant's leg to by a string to a mobile that runs above them, we notice that the infants tend to love this, that they notice if they can move their little leg, it will actually move the mobile, and it gives them a sense of control, a sense of ability to do things around them and to exercise a sense of what we might call agency, and that can be very motivating. So when Maslow talked about self-actualization, I talked about it as the ability to fulfill potential. And so whatever that is, to discover and exercise your talents, perhaps creativity. Sometimes he certainly talked about it as creating meaning in your life, but sometimes that's now being talked about as transcendence. It's important, though, according to a lot of research in psychology, that we also accept ourselves and our limitations and our situations realistically. So while we want to meet our potential, we don't want to exaggerate our potential and think that it's something beyond what we actually could do. It's important not only to keep growing, but to recognize that we have limits on ourselves as well. But people who tend to be very open to personal growth and change and to new experiences, we find, are focusing on self-actualization. It's hard to do that, though, if you feel unsafe or you don't have those basic physiological needs met a lot of the time. It's very difficult to do that. Okay. So when Maslow was really looking at people later in their lives, as he got older, he interviewed people, and he found out that people also want to go beyond themselves, want to leave something behind when they die. They want to have had an impact on others. And that in fact, when people are most psychologically healthy, they tend to be less self-focused and more focused on achieving things beyond themselves, including helping other people. And so that human beings really have a need to work for things beyond themselves and to connect with others beyond themselves. So we experience compassion, we care for others, we do things designed to have an impact on other humans or other living creatures in general. And when we're doing that, we're working towards meeting our needs for self-transcendence, especially when we're not going to get anything concrete from it. We're not doing things to help others with the expectation that they're going to help us. So is it true then that we tend to focus on those lower needs and if they're not met, and that we can't focus on higher needs if our lower needs aren't met? According to at least some studies cited by your textbook, in fact, in one study in particular where they looked at 77,000 people in the poorest nations of the world, where people didn't have a lot of food security, we had to focus on meeting those physiological and safety needs more than higher needs because they just weren't being met. When we looked at people in those circumstances, the need to be independent was much less pursued. That need, for example, the desire to have freedom to make your own decisions, to be independent from other people. That's an important need. And if we can meet that, we're going to be more satisfied with our lives. But that having freedom when you don't have any food to eat, you're not going to be very happy. You're not going to have high levels of life satisfaction. And so we really do often need to meet those basic needs before we can focus on the higher needs and the mental health benefits that focusing on those higher needs provide. So connected to this is the idea, does money give you happiness? And the answer to that is sort of. According to a lot of research, if you're very, very poor and then you get more money, you're going to be happier. at least for a while, especially if then you can meet those basic physiological needs. However, increasing wealth does not necessarily give you increased happiness. So if you have your basic needs met, often increased money is not going to raise your happiness level by very much at all, or your life satisfaction level. And so it's important to make sure that when we try to figure out how to live our lives, that we try to find ways to meet our basic needs in a predictable way that doesn't lead to a lot of insecurity. So having job security is important. Having a decent income is important, but having very high levels of income is not very important when we look at who is happiest in their lives and who has the greatest amount of satisfaction. So I'm just going to wrap up this section by talking about some other ideas in motivation. One of those ideas, or some of those ideas, come from psychodynamic theory, psychoanalytic theory, which, if you remember, was a theory proposed by Sigmund Freud and then his followers and their followers. And they focused a lot on how some of what is in our mind is conscious and some of it is unconscious. So it's useful to think about how when we do things, sometimes we're aware of why we're doing them, and sometimes we're not aware, or we're only partially aware. So let's say you were aggressive, you became angry and got very aggressive at other people and hurt them. Well, if you did that, you may be aware of why you did it, but sometimes you may be confused. Why was I so angry, and why did I hurt that person? You may not really know the right reason. And that's because, says Freud and his followers, those reasons were unconscious. We're going to talk a lot more about conscious versus unconscious motivation when we talk about the personality chapter, the personality unit in the class. But just be aware that some of our motivations are conscious and some of our motivations are not conscious. Okay. When we're talking about psychoanalytic theory, we're talking about Freud's theory, but Freud had many followers and they had followers, and they took his theory and changed it in a variety of ways, making it psychodynamic theory. So we'll talk more about these theories again in the personality chapter, as well as in the chapter about mental health and mental illness. As we're talking about these motivations and conscious and not conscious motivations, I just want to let you know that Freud and his followers often talked about drives as well. So the biological theorists of motivation will talk about drives like as sort of like an instinct, like a drive to eat food. Might talk about my dog's drive to kill little animals if he could. That these are very biologically based drives. Freud used that term drive as well, certainly to talk about the sex drive, but he assumed that we're driven to live for our life, and also we're driven sometimes maybe for death. So this got really philosophical in his theories. But basically he said what drives human beings the most is that need for pleasure, which he associated with sexuality a lot. But if we remember from the beginning of this unit, I talked about the hedonic principle, that human beings are driven to feel good and not feel bad. And Freud talked about that in his theory. He talked about the drive for pleasure and to feel good as connected very much not only to sexuality, but our drive just to be alive. He also would talk about how people are driven for achievement. So that was also part of his psychoanalytic theory. But he said that drive to achieve and to get better is also part of that basic drive to live. It was also when he saw that people often felt driven to gain power and control over their environment and over other people, and that was also part of that life drive at times. And so he talked about the need for achievement and control, but sometimes we could talk about it as a need for power. And certainly we can look at people in the world. Why does somebody want to be president, for example? I don't really want to be president. Even if I could be president, I wouldn't want to be president. But my guess is those who want to be president, part of what drives them to do that is a desire for power. And power, when you have power over others, you have a sense of control over others. And sometimes that can actually be intoxicating. We can think about that in a less grandiose kind of way as we think about the joy we get when we improve at a video game or feel a sense of control playing a video game, or just getting the right answer to something. It gives us not only a sense of achievement, but a sense of control. When we think about what gives us pleasure, though, Freud was very aware that when we love and feel a sense of belong, we feel a sense of pleasure as well. Now, in addition to that desire for pleasure that drives us in these different ways, Freud says we also seek to minimize anxiety, shame, and guilt, to minimize negative emotions. And he noticed that what happens a lot of the times in the unconscious mind of people is that what they do is that sometimes we have desires for things, maybe desires connected to pleasure, but we've been taught that those desires are bad, that we should be ashamed of those desires or feel guilty about those desires. The two kinds of desires that we're most often taught are bad are desires connected to aggression and desires connected to sexuality. And then if we look throughout the world at what people are most ashamed of or feel most guilty about, it's connected to those things of the desire to aggress or to be violent or to hurt others, or the desire to have certain kinds of sexual experiences. And that he thought when we have those desires, because they create a sense of shame and guilt and perhaps anxiety, what we might do is push those desires into our unconscious, into what's happening below our awareness, that we might not even be aware that we have those desires because it just makes us feel too bad to have the desires. So we keep them in our unconscious mind, according to Freud, a lot of the time, especially if we've been taught that it's very bad to have those desires. And so we might disguise from ourselves our true motivations, especially if they're aggressive or sexual. We'll cover this a lot more in the personality chapter. Here we see a picture of an iceberg. And if you know anything about icebergs, which I didn't until fairly recently, most of an iceberg that's floating in the water, most of it is underneath the water. And we can use that as a metaphor for the mind, according to Freud, that we have some things that happen in our conscious mind which are above the water that we're aware of. We have other things in our mind we're not thinking about right now, but if we started to think about them, we could bring them into our conscious mind. That's the preconscious. And then we have an unconscious mind, which includes things, for example, perhaps like sexual desires that you feel ashamed about and you're not even aware you have, fears you don't want to admit to yourself that you have, violent motivations, sometimes whatever you think of as immoral urges or desires or wishes or selfish needs, you may push those into your unconscious mind. He said you might push memories of shameful experiences into your unconscious mind as well as of traumatic experiences. So all of those things occupy the unconscious, which, according to Freud, was most of your mind. What he thought, though, is that those things that you push under in your unconscious, that you're going to be more psychologically healthy if you can become more conscious of those things. But that we're motivated to keep a lot of that in our unconscious because it's just too painful to remember or to acknowledge those things. All right, let's just quickly wrap up with, from a different theoretical perspective, a cognitive theoretical perspective, this idea that there are two kinds of motivations: intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation. I talked about this a little bit in a previous unit, but it's important to be aware that why we do what we do, sometimes we do it for extrinsic things, that if I do this thing, I'll get something else that I want. If we're looking at things, if we're looking at why people go to school, for example, why you might want a degree, if you're doing it all for that diploma or to get that certain job, you're doing it for an extrinsic motivation. If you're doing it just because you love it, that's an intrinsic motivation. It gives you pleasure to do it. I like doing it. And so you do it because you want to do it. That's an intrinsic, internally to yourself. That's an intrinsic motivation. Finally, sometimes cognitive psychologists will talk about approach or avoidance motivation. An approach motivation is a motivation to get something positive. An avoidance motivation is a motivation to avoid something negative. So we are motivated to avoid bad things and to approach good things as we understand them. In a lot of circumstances, avoidance motivation can be more powerful. And so it depends a little bit on the individual, but generally speaking, we are pushed more to avoid a bad thing than to get a good thing. And we see this play out all the time when people try to avoid losing what they feel like they already have, and that pushes them much more than to approach something that, or to go after something that they don't have. So that idea that if I already have something and something, say money, let's say I have a bunch of money and there's some kind of threat to that money I already have, that will push people more than the idea that if you do something new, you could get more money. So people tend to be very attached to what they have, and they like the idea of getting better things, but not as much. It's not going to push them as much as the idea that I want to avoid losing good things. Okay, so that wraps up the chapter. I hope that's helpful to you, and I hope if you have questions, you'll let me know. So I'm going to stop the recording here and figure out how to do that. I hope it was recording as I went through everything there. Escape, no, escape is not working. Oh no, did I just do that lecture and it didn't record?